Okay, amazing. Well, now we're here, and you have this, in my opinion, a very important paper called Prejudice Model 1.0, a predictive model of prejudice. This is quite a new paper in the sense that you're applying a predictive model to a social psychological construct within prejudice. Um, Before we get there, I was just wondering, can we define what is prejudice? How is it normally studied? Is it a cognitive or emotional phenomenon? The floor is yours.
Yeah, yeah. So like any construct or like word in psychology, there's like a bunch of different meanings or interpretations that different scientists have used over time. How we're using it is just kind of like differential liking. It's kind of like the simplest operationalization of it. So and even in the paper we have two versions. So one would just be like you rate the outgroup, how warm to cold do you feel towards them? That's one, and then the other one would be like differential liking. So like I rate my own group, and then I rate the other group, and the difference between those is how we would call it prejudice. But there's been like other classic definitions in the field, such as like prejudice has a behavioral, emotional, and cognitive component. Um, Jim Sedanius has an argument that prejudice is about like power structures. So with that definition, what we say in the paper is that like, say you have the Ku Klux Klan in the U.S. and then black folks, because black folks are kind of low power in that situation, that they couldn't actually show prejudice towards the KKK by that definition because they're like low power. And so lots of different ways of defining it, but our paper is very specifically about just like animus or just like differential liking for groups.
So like kind of like a different score and a negative number would be some type of negative, I don't want to say affect, but a negative percept on this group.
Yeah, you could just say liking. So I like my group more than another group, something like that.
And how did you actually come to create this different score?
It's super common in the field, really. We did it in the paper because it's like really simple. And we wanted to kind of arrive at a universal model of differential liking. So, for example, even in the Sidanius explanation I gave a second ago, we kind of want to understand why maybe black people don't like the Ku Klux Klan and what are the ingredients. And I think kind of a conceptual background that we were using to approach this with was that like historically groups of humans have like not liked each other in a variety of spaces, and we just wanted to understand that. Yeah.
And when you say groups of people, you mean like in group versus out group. You're not talking like, you're not adding like a specific demographic that goes in another demographic. It's purely based off of some type of geography and proximity, correct?
Yeah, I think so. So we all belong to like lots of different groups. We wanted kind of like what we were going to arrive at to apply to the past, just like, I don't know, groups of cavemen fighting each other. Humans are super tribal, but also to groups that like don't exist in the future. And so like there are group coalitions that literally don't exist right now, but we think this like prejudice inclination between different groups of humans is like a thing that humans have always exhibited,
It's
and it should apply to the future
construct.
Seems like it's been around. Yeah.
Okay. I know the word cause in social psychology is a big one, but before we get into your model, I was wondering if we could have like a kind of an overview of what are potential causes to prejudice itself.
Right. Let's see. So I'd say there's like a few different families, and this is like unofficial, so call this like a taxonomy, that most people believe probably causes prejudice. So this would be the situation in which you're raised, all the experiences you've ever had in your life, call it like socialization processes, but also personality factors. So even two people raised in the exact same environment and exposed to the same stimuli and experiences might have like different levels of prejudice because of some sort of personality dimension. And this is basically like nature versus nurture that I'm talking right now. Psychology can't really measure all that stuff though, so we're really good at measuring like personality characteristics, and I feel like the field has focused a lot of attention on that. We don't really have great measures of like the amount of media that you've been exposed to in your lifetime that might shape your attitudes towards just that group, or I don't know, the conversations you've had with people throughout your life. Those are like harder things for us to measure, even though we all think that they probably play some sort of causal role.
Right. And is it conceivable that what is studied in the lab to kind of isolate these variables, is it a good replication of what people would experience in the not natural world, but like in the outside world?
Maybe. I think the field has focused a lot on this construct of prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see on my board over there, it says, "Is prejudice the point?" This is something I think about a lot. The reason we study prejudice is because it's this attitude that we think is related to behavior out in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's open questions about whether prejudice, like really, I think most people in this space care about differential behaviors to
Right.
different groups of people. We study prejudice because we can, and we think it applies to this differential behavior,
Mm-hmm.
but there's open questions like how strong that link is.
Right. And I was thinking about this, and I don't really know if this is possible, but is there like, are there any biomarkers to prejudice? Obviously, it'd be almost impossible, at least in my estimation, to like really say how heritable is prejudice. But
Mhm.
are there any biomarkers to that?
No, not that I know of. I don't know if people have really like looked at it. So people do think there's like personality dispositions
Mhm.
that give rise to a more like xenophobic attitude in general, and presumably, if it's like a genetic thing, that maybe there is something under the hood, but nothing that psychologists have identified for sure.
Right. And also, like, I think just to keep in mind, like, a personality factor might not be necessarily linked to like an emotional or a cognitive factor. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of convolution in this idea of prejudice. And last question about like kind of defining prejudice. Do we know what emotions are involved in this mental state, I guess?
Yeah, so it's thought. I think the emotion part is kind of like part and parcel of prejudice, meaning having differential liking kind of comes along
Mhm.
with a bunch of emotional components, which is why we do certain things in the paper with emotions. But we can talk about that.
Sure.
So there's like Diane Mackey and Smith have done a lot of like intergroup emotions, and kind of like anger and disgust are kind of the ones that are related to like stronger negative feelings between groups. Contempt, which is really just like thought to be roughly a mix between
Mhm.
anger and disgust. So those are kind of like the main emotions in that area. But probably, I mean, as we'll discuss in a second, threat is like a major predictor of
Mhm.
prejudice in our model, and I guess that would be like anxiety and fear.
Right, but also actual versus perceived threat. There's a
Right.
distinction, right?
We have them both, but I think like in terms of the person experiencing it, it kind of like translates into the same thing, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
that's very true.
Yeah.
So now talking about your model, what inspired its creation?
Right. So over COVID, a bunch of friends slash colleagues and I started a journal club, just to read a bunch of papers. A lot of these people were in different areas like emotions and infant development work, and so we kind of like focused on like methods papers and like philosophy of science papers, as we were discussing before, just because they would apply to like all of our research programs, and because we hadn't had a lot of training in it, and it was kind of like a shared interest. We read about a lot of things in there, but a good amount of them were just on theorizing and the limitations of verbal theories and formal theories, and trying to figure out like what these things were. There were some other people talking about them in the field, and I imagine all like over time, I just always am thinking about how to apply this stuff to my own work, and kind of this is what came out of that for sure.
And can you just briefly explain what's the difference between a verbal versus a formal theory, at least in your field?
Yeah, sure. So psychology is kind of an adolescent science compared to some other ones, and a lot of our theories or predictions are something like a person in this condition will express more anger than a person in that condition. Or, so that would be kind of like a experimental design, but a correlation might be something like, as a person with right-wing authoritarianism, as a person's right-wing authoritarianism goes up, this is a personality construct, their level of prejudice also goes up.
Right.
And so those are like pretty vague. There's a lot of like you're basically looking to see whether the relationship between, say, right-wing authoritarianism and prejudice is just greater than 0.
Right.
And that could be 0.1, which is a really weak correlation. That could be 0.9, which is a super, super strong correlation. And then you can imagine the flip. So say as right-wing authoritarianism goes up, prejudice goes down, but it's like negative 0.1. So the difference between like 0.1, which supports your theory, and negative 0.1, which is the opposite of your verbal theory, those are actually really close. That's like that's like a 0.2 difference, right?
Right.
But like a 0.1 and a 0.9, that's like a 0.8 difference. Not to get too mathy for your listeners right now.
Yeah.
Basically just shows that our predictions are like super, super imprecise. And even though those things are closer, one would be interpreted as like supporting the theory, one would be rejecting the theory. And so this is the limitation of a verbal theory, where a lot of the evidence that comes out of your study design can be seen to be supporting your theory because it was like super vague. So in like classic like model evaluation parlance, this would be called like a weak theory or like a low risk theory because they're too hard to falsify. And a strong theory would be one that's like super, super easy to falsify. It makes a prediction of the relationship between RWA and prejudice as like a 0.62.
Right.
And
which would be very strong in social science.
That'd be strong. But if you got like a 0.8, you're a little off. And so that's easier to falsify. Or if you got like a 0.4, you know you're a little off. It's easier to falsify. And so just making more specific predictions, which you can only do with numbers and what I'm going to call right now like a predictive or a formal model, just allows the field maybe to advance faster in finding out where you're wrong and exactly by how much you're wrong and why you're wrong.
Okay. And how did you go about constructing this model? Like not necessarily where did you start, but like what was like the roadmap looking like, and how did you get to where you were in the paper, where you kind of like you're doing these various studies on like bias and threat and contact? Like where did it all start, and how did you kind of like narrow it out?
Yeah, sure. I should say what we're doing. So we've arrived at like a formal model of prejudice where we have the ingredients, the specific numbers that are involved in predicting it to enable falsification more easily. So what we did first was we kind of reviewed the whole prejudice literature. What's kind of like a problem in this space that was partly the genesis of this project is that like really we've been studying prejudice, like it's been a core base of social psych since like World War II essentially, when people were just like, damn, what just happened? There's a lot of conflict that caused a lot of disruption and death around the world. And people in North America mostly began studying like lots of things that kind of ended up being in what became like social psychology. And so since like 1946, we've been studying prejudice for like 80, 90 years. We have a lot of like theories about the causes of prejudice. And kind of a problem, though, there is that, like, we have all these theories, like, a lot now. Like, can they all be right at the same time? There's a thing that we read in this journal club called the Piranha problem, which is that a lot of different labs developed their theories independent of one another. And they would, like, we think this thing causes prejudice. They would measure it and show a relation with prejudice, and, like, boom, we have a theory. But the Piranha problem highlights that like these weren't all developed together like in the same tank, and that really there might be like some overlap between these different theories. And meaning like if you measured your new theory, but also all the other ones that previously already existed, you might realize that like there's some overlap between those. This is called the Piranha problem because it's the idea like if you put them all in the same fish tank, some of them would eat each other, which I don't think piranhas even do, but it's a conceptual time. And so we were like, okay, let's measure all these theories all at the same time, put them in the tank, and like see what the survivors are. And what that means in like statistical language is like which ones have the strongest relationships with prejudice, kind of like controlling for the relationships between these different constructs or the fish. And so we just looked at the whole literature, identified all the theorized causes of prejudice that we could find, and then, kind of based on what we were talking about before, like psychology can't actually measure a lot of those. So then we found measures of all the stuff that we could measure, collected it all, put it in the same pot, and like built a model from it, just to kind of see what the survivors were.
Okay. And when you say looked at all the literature, do you mean like all studies since 1946?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
So we tried to find all the theorized causes of prejudice.
Yeah. Okay. actually brings up a question. How did the theories of prejudice kind of evolve from 1946 onwards? Like, what stayed and what left behind? What was left behind? Excuse me.
Right. So let's see. I'm trying to think about. There's gonna be a mishmash. There's an early book by Gordon Allport, maybe like 1954, called "The Nature of Prejudice." It was just this. A lot of times it doesn't even have data. He's just kind of like writing his ideas, but it's like incredibly prescient. It's pure, actually, absolutely a genius because he's like spot on like a number of things.
Yeah.
So he kind of writes about a lot of stuff there, and that kind of like guided early social psych research into groups and stereotypes. But I think an early thing that happened was kind of in the personality domain, where people noticed. There's some work by like Altemeyer, kind of gave rise to like the prejudiced personality. Basically, the idea was that they noticed that it wasn't like you or I would have like strong negative attitudes towards one group, but then like be really positive to this group and negative towards that group. It was that like people either seemed to be like pretty warm toward a bunch of outgroups, or people were pretty negative to a lot. So if a person was xenophobic or prejudiced against one group, say like black people, they were also pretty prejudiced towards like Asian people, if that makes sense. And that gave rise to the idea that like really there's personality characteristics that are make you like more or less xenophobic, and people began studying prejudice from like a personality perspective. And I'd say that dominated the field for like 40 years, and it's resulted in like a lot of what's gone into the paper. So there's like the majority of the things that went into this fish tank were personality constructs that are thought to be associated in like kind of causes of prejudice essentially.
Okay. But personality also as a field kind of evolved from then as well. What were the, I guess, like main personality factors that you chose to include in your model?
Right. So we have things like clear personality factors from the work I was just talking about would be like right-wing authoritarianism. But we also have social dominance orientation. They kind of come together a lot.
But they're mutually exclusive to a certain extent.
Some people have argued that. Yeah,
Okay.
they're positively correlated, but they're supposed to be theoretically capture some independent stuff.
Yeah.
For sure. And there's some messiness here. Like right-wing authoritarianism, we know well, like captures like political orientation as well. It's not like a pure measure of prejudice. Other stuff that's like a little bit more on the fence is like loneliness. You could think of that as a personality characteristic or situational. It's probably like a bit of a mix. What else do we have in there? We have some like basic big five stuff that some people have found relationship with. So these are like the 5 large personality factors, and openness to new experiences and agreeableness, the 2 subcomponents, are thought to be, there's like some work showing that they're related to prejudice.
Positively or negatively?
Agreeableness is negative. Actually, I think both are negative.
Okay.
Yeah, not totally sure. No, I'm pretty sure.
So so if you're higher to openness to experience, which means you're more creative and you're very susceptible to like intellectual ideas, not necessarily intelligence, but intellectual ideas, you're more or less prejudiced?
Less prejudice.
Okay.
These are people who like travel and do drugs.
Yeah,
or more likely to do drugs.
Creative.
Things like that. Yeah.
And so if you're more agreeable, so you're high in empathy and care, you're less prejudiced.
Yes.
Okay. So it's when you're going down on the rigidity of it and the more, I guess, self-centered version of personality, those 2 personality traits, you're more prejudiced.
That's like, some people have published that in the literature.
Okay.
We actually, well, in the final model, I guess we'll get there. We actually find agreeable as one of the surviving fish.
Yes.
But we don't find openness to new experience as a survivor.
And that brings me to ask you, how come extroversion was not involved in the model? Because I would imagine that if you're really either both really exposed to people or not exposed to people, you'd kind of have this disposition to lean either way.
Yeah, we just didn't find consistent evidence for it in the literature.
Interesting.
So we weren't really trying to like introduce new causes or really measure everything. It was more like if we could find a few papers that were arguing that this is like a causal relationship, that was something we tried to measure and include.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think 32 to 36 is the stuff that we found and could measure and include that kind of went into the pot.
Which is actually quite a lot for a social science paper.
It's not really done.
Yeah. And I guess another question is, did you look into social economic status?
So I think this is kind of bringing up demographics,
It is.
and we made a decision not to include that in the model, which definitely you're not alone, like wondering about it or questioning. Our logic was, so demographics would be things like whether the person expressing prejudice is like man or a woman, straight or gay, black or white, high SES or low SES, maybe like like Republican or Democrat in the U.S. And these would undoubtedly like improve our predictive ability because there are differences between these groups on prejudice. But the reason we chose not to include any of these for two reasons. One is that we wanted our model to like work everywhere. And so say we just had like a room full of women,
Yep.
but we had gender in the model, it wouldn't really work there because like we would only have women. We still want to predict prejudice in that situation. Or imagine sometime in the future when Republicans and Democrats no longer exist, that would no longer be like a useful predictor. Or just go to any other country where the U.S. in particular is unipolar in its like liberal to conservative landscape, and really that's totally unique. That doesn't reflect the political landscape of like most other countries. So we wanted something that would just work across a lot of scenarios. And also what it means to include demographics in the model is to say that like, say we went back to gender, men and women, it'd be kind of saying that like men are just inherently more prejudiced than women in a way that cannot be explained by psychological characteristics. And we just don't believe that is true. But reasonable people might disagree.
Yeah, I mean, it would also like mess with like the causality of it, because you assume that just because you have higher testosterone, you're more prejudiced. But
yeah, at least that's a mechanism.
Yeah,
that you could measure. But even that, it would just be saying like men inherently more prejudice. Like men causes prejudice.
Right.
Women causes prejudice, and we don't believe that.
Right. Well, that's a very good thing that you excluded in that sense. But just to kind of clarify why I brought up the questions, because it would still be easier to kind of track where people fit on like a graph or a plot. It doesn't necessarily mean that like, we should look at this as a cause for prejudice.
It would definitely increase like our ability to predict. Our models are doing about 60% of the 50 to 60% of the variance regularly, which is pretty good in psychology. Pretty pathetic compared to like physics or weather or climate. And including additional demographics would certainly like would eat up some of that unexplained variance, but we just are choosing not to do that.
Right. And also considering that a lot of social psychology studies are done in like Western hemispheres, would that introduce this form of bias by any chance?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's like a limitation of our paper for the most part too. To the extent that anything that we're measuring is like more Western, then the model won't really hold up. I will say we've tested it in a UK sample, and then we tested it in a sample in India as well with Muslims and Hindus and attitudes along like religious boundaries there. And the model like did pretty good, but there's still some variations. So like that's certainly something that needs to be worked out, is like the generalizability of our model.
Right. And again, to emphasize, at the beginning of the conversation, you said you wanted to make a universal model, so that's why you're kind of expanding this way. This is also a question that I had, which is, will there be like some exceptions to the universality of the model in the sense of like highly violent offenders in prison, psychopathy, etc.?
Meaning like
will there be
like their prejudice towards other people or people's prejudices towards them?
Good clarification. I was meaning like, will they have a difficult time fitting in the model because they're statistically speaking on a very extreme end of the behavioral distribution, and I'm wondering if that can account for that.
Maybe, I don't know. But that would be another way of like testing the generalizability, I guess. If you want to call like, it's not culture, but they're variations, and theoretically this like should apply, but like realistically probably is going to break down. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And so like that's like the next phase is like finding what's called like the boundary conditions of our model, or ways to like improve it. We have kind of like a phase in the paper where we like kind of in a rudimentary way explored some boundary conditions, just trying to find out where our model would break down a little bit, and kind of like, so for example, we asked about police, which is not a traditionally studied group, and it's like,
you mean attitude towards police?
Correct. Yeah. And like Like, I don't necessarily identify as like a non-police or like a citizen. You know, like that's not an identity that I'm thinking about a lot. So the in-group and out-group distinction is a little bit blurry, but it worked actually well with police. But like we also did like rollerbladers, which is kind of an amorphous group that, you know, sometimes you're a rollerblader, sometimes you're not, and the model totally broke down there. So like finding exactly what are the things that doesn't allow our model to predict attitudes is like future work.
I mean, the most extreme version of that is what you asked about attitudes towards broccoli, right? So
Broccoli and squirrels. Yeah, exactly. And that was a little bit silly, or it seems silly on the face, but really this is called like discriminant validity, I guess. We are theoretically developing a model of prejudice based on the prejudice literature. We didn't want to have a model of like generalized liking. So like we shouldn't be able to predict your feelings towards like a red lampshade from our model, which is supposed to be towards like other humans.
right.
And so we were trying to get further and further systematically away from the classically studied groups, and like no one studies attitudes towards squirrels or broccoli. And the models there like totally broke down. So we kind of wanted to see like, what does it look like when the model breaks down? Like what's the statistical evidence for like, how can we determine when the model is not working?
Right. And would that fall under like establishing the boundary conditions of the model?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. We actually had a round where we went with attitudes toward potatoes instead of broccoli.
Okay.
But we found that what we think is happening is that like friends would just think of their friends that they would call like a potato. And people had really positive attitudes towards potatoes. Okay. So I don't think they were thinking of the vegetable, but like a anthropomorphized version.
Right. And is this like is the model that you're creating? Would you say that it is very atheoretical?
No. Well, so there's two parts to that question. One is like we're literally drawing on like every theory in the field, and like trying to measure the constructs that they've theorized. So super theoretical from that perspective, in terms of like, yeah, I mean it's literally all the theories all at the same time, and there's a lot of like philosophy that kind of needs to be established in the beginning parts of the paper to even justify what we're doing. On the other hand, when it comes to the actual statistical modeling, it's totally atheoretical. We're using an approach called elastic net regularization, which is it's a model selection technique, which means it essentially tells us which variables to keep, and which variables to get rid of. And that is a totally data-driven process that has no theory in it. So theory was super important in determining like what goes into the pot. But then like once it's in there, what gets selected was data-driven.
Okay. And so what were the results of your model? I know there's a lot of them, so you can take your time to break it all down.
Yeah. It's not so bad actually. So we had about 36 or 32 constructs that went in. I forget exactly.
I believe it was 32.
Okay. On average, like this approach selected like 10, but then we kind of whittled it down through various phases. And so really there's two models that we develop. One, which is the difference score. So the difference between like my ratings of my group, whatever that is, and my ratings of an outgroup, whatever that is. And then there's just like the straight up ratings of the outgroup. And we have slightly different results based on these two. So the main ingredients are contact, which is a major thing that's been studied in the field, threat, and identification. That's the model that explains the difference score. It's really just those three ingredients, though there's like a few different measures of threat in there. And then the ratings of the outgroup alone is contact, threat, and agreeableness. So the two models are mostly the same except for the identification and the agreeableness part.
Okay. And so contact can be understood as like proximity versus distance.
People have studied a lot of different ways, and in fact, the first model has two different measures of contact because classically it's been studied or quantified a lot of ways. I think the survivors that came out of our modeling approach was just like the number of outgroup friends you have, and then the rated like positivity of the contact you have. So it's kind of like a quality and a quantity measure that both survived. And this is maybe the longest, or like maybe the construct that has like the most evidence of support in all the intergroup literature. there's like a big meta-analysis which finds like a negative relationship of like negative 0.21 Pettigrew and Trop, and that it's coincidence, but it's exactly the coefficient that we landed on in our model as well. So just as people have more contact with members of the outgroup, their prejudice goes down.
Okay. And threat can be understood as symbolic, so so like how you perceive it, and then physical or actual threat.
Yeah, so just like contact, threat is also a super old construct in psychology that you've probably learned about in my class, because like some of the earliest theories were about like realistic threat or relative deprivation. So like my group has some stuff. No, your group has some stuff. My group is missing some stuff. Prejudice as a result of that, and conflict happens.
Right.
Threat's been measured a few different ways, and we had a few different measures in the paper. The two that survived was what will be called symbolic threat, and this is the idea that your values threaten my values. So it's not about like actual physical conflict. It's just that like you believe in something that I don't, and that threatens my worldview. And then we had a generalized measure that we took from another paper, which is a bit of like what's called realistic and symbolic, probably, which just says it's a single item, and it's like people from X group pose problems for people like me. Or it's 3 items, but that's like the gist of all of that.
Right.
And so that might capture, it might overlap a little bit with that symbolic element, but it might also be like they're getting jobs that I need, and so that's like a realistic threat. Or I want to go home, and they like pose like a risk of like mugging me or something like that, and that'd be a realistic threat as well.
Right. And so there's like you can see that there's like an overlap between contact and threat where there's some distance, right?
Some distance. What do you mean exactly?
So like, if like the getting job on, it's like if you see from like afar that a certain outgroup is getting more employment and more like, I guess, wealth opportunities to get an income, you're not really going to go closer to those people, right?
Oh, right.
That's what I mean. Like so like you can see like these are mutually like irreducible, but there's like some overlap going back and forth that kind of they kind of like feed back to each other.
Right. I mean, I think that's why kind of they've ended up in the model together, is that they both predict prejudice, but they do have some sort of independent contribution. But surely these things are related to each other as well, and some sort of like calls a way that we don't understand yet. So if you're really threatened by a group, you're probably way less likely to like seek them out and be friends with them. So probably contact would be lower.
Right.
Or the reverse. I'm sure it's bidirectional. Like if you just are kind of forced into more contact with group X through maybe work or shared social group, your threat goes down because you just don't literally view them as outgroup as you might have in the first place.
Right. And identification, is that like self-identity with the specific group?
Yeah, so this is actually our strongest predictor in the model, which I was a little surprised by in this first model. And it's just like, so say for example, we're measuring attitudes between like white people would be the in-group and black people would be the out-group. To the extent that like being white is like a really big part of my identity, that was the biggest predictor of more negative attitudes towards black people.
Okay.
So we're not totally sure, but this might be driven more by like an in-group love rather than an out-group hate aspect, because this is like a difference score, right? So you might rate your, like, a difference of 1 might be like, I rate my own group a 7, which is really high, and then the out group a 6, which is also pretty high. But there's a difference. But it could also be, I rate my in group like a 1 and the out group like a 0. Those would kind of have the same value. So it does hinge on like how much you care about yourself. So it's possible that these like strong identifiers just rate their in group like really high.
Okay.
And they're not like hating the out group, but they just don't like them as much as they love their in group.
Okay. And is there any way to kind of improve the, I guess, like test batteries to kind of capture those differences?
No, it's kind of like, it's more of like a conceptual choice. We can dig into it, and there's like a whole, Marilyn Brewer has a whole lot of work looking at out-group hate versus in-group love. And some whole areas of work, like my PhD advisor, like aversive racism framework, is kind of like a guiding philosophy is that like most people don't hate out-groups. They just like their in-groups more.
Right.
And that prejudice for most people in like your day-to-day experiences is more driven by like an indifference or a slight less caring for the out-group rather than like hatred.
Right.
And I think that and this is not even trying to explain like more extreme negative behaviors like actual like warfare or hate crimes or things like that. This is just like sitting next to somebody on the bus or slightly differential hiring rates.
Right.
That's like the framework. So there are whole areas that kind of looked at the in-group love versus out-group hate. We're purposely kind of trying to avoid that. That's what the difference score does, is it kind of naturally adjusts for someone who just like likes everybody. Rates the in-group a 7 and the out-group a 6 versus hates everybody. Rates like the in-group a -3, but the out-group a -4. That would be equated because we just care about like differential liking by that definition.
Okay. And just to clarify, some of this sounds like stereotyping. Are stereotypes or stereotyping and prejudice on the same continuum, or are they kind of different?
Right, so we cut out stereotyping from the model on purpose. So prejudice is kind of associations with a group with like positivity or negativity, period. Stereotypes are associations as well, but it'd be more about like anything like dogs being dogs and fur is an association or a stereotype that we might have. And so even though by definition they are different things, we think, and what's common in the field is that like the things that groups are associated with in and of themselves are can be more positive and negative. So for example, if you took like, I don't know, African American people and jazz, people have a relatively positive association with jazz. That's just like a stereotype. But then crime would be another association that's there. But crime is not like a neutral construct or attitude object. It's like negative. And like the dumb example that we make in the papers, if we associate like vampires with evil, like technically that's a stereotype, but evil is something that almost everybody feels bad about. So that would kind of like, we think that like as the things that groups are associated with become more negative, it just becomes more and more similar to prejudice. So a lot of people have kind of like tried to study attitudes towards different groups with stereotypical associations with things like intelligence or warmth, or like Muslim people with terrorism. These are like heavily loaded associations that we think just kind of become equivalent to prejudice.
Okay.
So we purposely didn't include them because we didn't want to like, if any of our predictors that went into the piranha fish tank essentially are prejudice, it kind of like, it ruins the whole model because it undermines all the relationships that would come out statistically.
And in your model, did you include, or at least try and include, any like emotional or affective components?
No, not at all, because we think emotion, it's for the same reason. We think that like anger and disgust are part of prejudice, like the dependent variable here. So to put them in the IV, we'd get strong relationships, but it's just because we're like using prejudice to predict prejudice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
So we do test later on how well our model can predict like intergroup attitudes. And it kind of breaks down actually. So we think that like anger from one group towards another, or disgust from one group towards another, must just have additional predictors that we're not capturing in our model. Okay.
So then I guess to kind of conceptualize your model, is it more of a cognitive thing that you're kind of constructing?
I mean, it wasn't on purpose, but that's partly how, actually no, I would say, so all the things we put into the pot, some of those things were more cognitive leaning, like personality constructs. But a lot of the survivors, like contact, that's just like experiences that people have in their day. Feelings of threat, that's not particularly cognitive either. But identification is certainly like a personality characteristic, even agreeableness, which came out in the other model. So I think we gave a lot of these like different subdomains an equal opportunity by putting them into the model together. But they didn't all come out equally.
Okay.
And part of that might just be the causes, but part of that is like some of these things are more difficult to measure, period. And if we have bad measures of it as a field, then it's unlikely to survive the fish tank, if that makes sense.
Right. Another thing is, to clarify, you were measuring purely attitudes. You're not really measuring behavior as a result of those attitudes, right?
Prejudice as the dependent variable is just, differential liking, no behavior at all. Right.
Do you want to like venture into that territory eventually of how like one leads to the other, not as a cause, but as like a correlation, or more of like is there some type of predicting variable here?
No, definitely. That's kind of going back to is prejudice the point, where I don't care about prejudice in and of itself. We study that as a field because we think it matters. But what's difficult with behavior is that So if we were in the, in a different, say like 5 years down the line, I'm developing this sort of model for like a behavior, like a discriminatory behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem is that like this discriminatory behavior from that discriminatory behavior, say like sitting close to somebody on a bus or differential hiring decisions, they probably just have like prejudice is presumably a common thread through both of those, but there's probably just like a lot of other factors that are also going on, and it just becomes really hard to apply a model uniquely across a lot of them. So people try to study discrimination in a more abstract way with these like economic games that presumably would apply across a lot of scenarios, but it's harder. But eventually, absolutely, that's where I want to go, is to see, okay, if we're doing a pretty good job with measuring this prejudice construct, how much does it actually predict behavior?